Hello, welcome back to the second to last section of The General in His Labyrinth by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Hope you have been enjoying this one if you've stuck around since the beginning. But yeah, we're just got two more sections to go, so getting close to the end. If you're just new around here for the first time, I'm Julie. I read books over here. We typically do a fiction, then a nonfiction. So coming up next will be a nonfiction read, which I will announce next time, right up top at the beginning of the video. But yeah, right now, if you're in a copy such as this one, we're on page 210. It's in the toward the beginning of what I think is technically chapter 7. So yeah, if you're on page 210 like I am, we're at middle bottom of the page where a new paragraph starts. Let's get going. With lightened baggage and a reduced entourage, they traveled as far as Trabaco on the first day. They continued the next day in good weather, but before noon they had to take refuge under a roadside shelter where they spent the night exposed to rain and the malignant winds out of the swamps. The general complained of pains in the spleen and the liver, and Jose Palacios prepared a potion from the French manual, but the pains became more severe, and his fever increased. At dawn, he was so prostrate that they carried him unconscious to the town of Soledad, where an old friend, Don Pedro Juan Vizbal, took him into his house. There he remained for over a month, suffering all manner of pains, made worse by the oppressive October rains. Soledad was well named. Its solitude consisted of 4 burning, desolate streets lined with the houses of the poor, located some 2 leagues from the place once called Barranca de San Nicola, which in a few years would become the most prosperous and hospitable city in the country and would later be named Barranquilla. The general could not have found a more peaceful spot or a house more favorable to his health. 6 Andalusian balconies flooded it with light, and the patio was well suited to meditation under the centenarian ceiba tree. The bedroom window overlooked the deserted little square with its ruined church and the houses painted in holiday colors with roofs of bitter palm. But domestic peace did not help him either. The first night he suffered a slight attack of vertigo, but he refused to admit that it was new evidence of his prostration. In accordance with the French manual, he described his illness as an attack of black bile aggravated by a general chill and a recurrence of rheumatism brought on by exposure. This multiple diagnosis increased his querulous diatribes against simultaneous medicines for different illnesses, for he said that the ones that were good for some ailments were bad for the others. But he also recognized that no medication helps the man who refuses to take it, and he complained every day about not having a good doctor, although he refused to be examined by the many who were sent to him. In a letter he wrote to his father during this time, Colonel Wilson said that the general could die at any moment, but that his rejection of doctors was the result of lucidity, not contempt. In reality, said Wilson, disease was the only enemy the general feared, and he refused to confront it so that he would not be distracted from the greater enterprise of his life. Attending to an illness is like working on a ship, the general had told him. 4 years earlier in Lima, O'Leary had suggested that he accept thorough medical treatment while he was preparing the Constitution of Bolivia, and his reply was decisive. You can't win 2 races at the same time. He seemed convinced that continual movement and self-reliance were a charm against disease. Fernanda Barriga had been in the habit of tying a bib around his neck and feeding him with a spoon as if he were a child, and he would accept the food and chew it in silence and even open his mouth again when he had finished. But now he took the plate and spoon from her and ate with his own hand without a bib, so that everyone would know he did not need anyone. It broke Jose Palacios' heart when he found the general attempting to do for himself the domestic chores that his servants or orderlies or aides-de-camp had always done for him. and Jose Palacios was not consoled to see him spill a flask of ink over himself while trying to fill an inkwell. This was something extraordinary, because everyone marveled that the general's hands did not tremble no matter how sick he was, and that his wrist was so steady he still cut and buffed his nails once a week and shaved himself every day. In his paradise in Lima, he'd spent a joyous night with a young girl who was covered with fine straight down over every millimeter of her Bedouin skin. At dawn, while he was shaving, he looked at her lying naked in the bed, adrift in the peaceful sleep of a satisfied woman, and he could not resist the temptation of possessing her forever with a sacramental act. He covered her from head to foot with shaving lather, and with a pleasure that like that of love. He shaved her clean with his razor, sometimes using his right hand, sometimes his left, as he shaved every part of her body, even the eyebrows that grew together, and left her doubly naked inside her magnificent newborn's body. She asked her soul in shreds if he really loved her, and he answered with the same ritual phrase he had strewn without pity in so many hearts throughout his life: "More than anyone in this world." In the town of Soledad, again, while he was shaving, he submitted to the same sacrificial rite. He began by cutting off one of the few limp, white locks of hair he had left, obeying what seemed to be a childish impulse, and then he cut off another in a more conscious way. And after that, all of them at random, as if he were cutting grass. While through the cracks in his voice, he declaimed his favorite stanzas from La Araucana, Jose Palacios came into the bedroom to see whom he was talking to, and found him shaving his lathered skull. Not a hair was left on his head. The exorcism did not redeem him. He wore the silk cap during the day, and at night he put on the red hood, but he could not tolerate the icy gusts of despondency. He got up to pace through the darkness in the enormous moonlit house, only now he could not walk naked on hot nights, but wrapped himself in a blanket, so he would not shiver with cold. During the day, the blanket was not enough, and he resolved to wear the red hood over the silk cap. The military's quibbling intrigues and the abuses of the politicians exasperated him so much that one afternoon he decided with a blow to the table that he could not endure any of them any longer. "Tell them I'm consumptive, so they won't come back," he shouted. His determination was so drastic that he forbade military uniforms and rituals in the house. But he could not survive without them, so that the consolatory interviews and sterile secret meetings continued as always, against his own orders. And then he felt so ill that he agreed to a doctor's visit on the condition that he not examine him or ask him questions about his pains or attempt to give him anything to drink. "Just to talk," he said. The physician selected could not have been more to his liking. Hercules Gastelbondo was an immense, placid old man, anointed with contentment, whose skull was radiant with total baldness, and who possessed the patience of a drowned man, which in itself alleviated the suffering of others. His incredulity and scientific daring were famous all along the coast. He prescribed chocolate cream with melted cheese for disturbances of the bile. He advised love-making during the languors of digestion as a fine palliative promoting long life, and he smoked endless wagon driver's cigars, which he rolled with rag paper and prescribed to his patients for all sort of equivocations of the body. The patients themselves said he never effected a complete cure, but entertained them instead with his florid eloquence. He would break into plebeian laughter. "Other doctors lose as many patients as I do," he would say, "but with me, they die happier." He arrived in the carriage of Señor Bartolomé Molinares, which came and went several times a day, carrying all kinds of spontaneous visitors until the general prohibited their coming without an invitation. He arrived dressed in wrinkled white linen, making his way through the rain, his pockets overflowing with things to eat, and carrying an umbrella so full of holes that it invited more water than it held back. The first thing he did after the formal greetings was to beg pardon for the stench of his half-smoked cigar. The general, who could not abide tobacco smoke, not then or ever, had already forgiven him. "I'm used to it," he said. "Manuela smokes cigars more disgusting than yours, even in bed, and of course she's closer to me than you are when she blows the smoke." Dr. Gastelbondo seized an opportunity that burned his soul. "Of course," he said. "How is she?" "Who?" "Doña Manuela." The general's reply was abrupt. "All right." And he changed the subject in so obvious a manner that the doctor laughed out loud to conceal his impertinence. There was no doubt the general knew that none of his gallant escapades was safe from the gossip of his entourage. He never boasted about his conquests, but there had been so many, and they had been so flagrant that the secrets of his bedroom were public knowledge. An ordinary letter took 3 months to travel from Lima to Caracas, but the gossip about his adventures seemed to fly with the speed of thought. Scandal followed him like a second shadow, and his lovers were marked forever with a cross of ashes, but he complied with the useless duty of protecting his secrets of love under a sacred code. No one ever heard an indiscretion from him regarding a woman he made love to, except Jose Palacios, who was his accomplice in everything, not even to satisfy a curiosity as innocent as Dr. Gastelbondo's, not even concerning Manuela Sáenz, whose intimacy with him was so public that there was little left to hide. Except for that momentary unpleasantness, Dr. Gastelbondo was a providential presence. He revived him with his learned lunacies. He shared with him the honey-dipped candies, the almond paste confections, the chocolate and cassava drops he carried in his pockets, which the general accepted out of courtesy and ate out of distraction. One day he complained that these salon sweets were good only for staving off hunger, but not for gaining back weight, which is what he desired. "Don't worry, Excellency," the doctor replied. "Everything that enters the mouth adds weight, and everything that leaves it is debased." The argument seemed so amusing to the general that he agreed to drink a large glass of wine and a cup of arrowroot with the doctor. Nevertheless, the humor improved by the doctor with so much painstaking care was disturbed by bad news. Nevertheless, I need to read that sentence over again. Apologies. We're on the bottom of page 216. Nevertheless, the humor improved by the doctor with so much painstaking care was disturbed by bad news. Someone told the general that, fearing contagion, the owner of the house where he had lived in Cartagena had burned the cot he slept in, the mattress and the sheets and everything that had passed through his hands during his stay. He ordered Don Juan de Dios Amador to use the money he had left with him to reimburse the owner for the destroyed items as if they were new and to pay for the rental of the house, but not even this could appease his bitterness. He felt worse a few days later when he learned that Don Joaquin Mosquera had passed through the area on his way to the United States and had not deigned to visit him. By questioning various people without concealing his disquiet, he learned that, in fact, Mosquera had been on the coast for more than a week while he waited for the ship, seen by many mutual friends as well as some enemies, and expressed to all of them his resentment of what he termed the general's ingratitude. At the moment they weighed anchor, when he was already in the launch that would carry him to the ship, he had summarized his fixed idea for everyone who came to see him off. "Never forget," he told them, "that man doesn't love anybody." Jose Palacios knew how sensitive the general was to such reproaches. Nothing pained or bewildered him more than people casting doubt on his affections, and he was capable of parting oceans and moving mountains with the terrible power of his charm until he convinced them of their error. During the plenitude of his glory, Delfina Guardiola, the belle of Angostura, became enraged by his inconstancy and slammed the doors of her house in his face. "You're a great man, General, greater than anyone," she told him, "but love is still too big for you." He climbed through the kitchen window and spent 3 days with her, and he almost lost a battle as well as his life while he was persuading Delfina to trust in his heart. Mosquera was beyond his reach, but he spoke about his rancor to everyone he could find. He never wearied of asking how a man had the right to talk of love who had permitted the general to be notified by official communique that Venezuela had resolved to repudiate and exile him. "He should be thankful I didn't respond and saved him from the condemnation of history," he shouted. He recalled everything he had done for Mosquera, how much he had helped him become who he was, how he had been obliged to tolerate the stupidities of his rural narcissism. At last he wrote a long, desperate letter to a mutual friend to make certain the sound of his indignation would reach Mosquera anywhere in the world. On the other hand, the news he did not receive shrouded him like an invisible fog. Urdaneta still had not answered his letters. Briceño Mendez, his man in Venezuela, had sent him a letter along with some of the Jamaican fruits he was so fond of, but the messenger had drowned. The inaction of Justo Briceño, his man on the eastern frontier, drove him to despair. Urdaneta's silence had cast a shadow over the country. The death of Fernandez Madrid, his correspondent in London, had cast a shadow over the world. What the general did not know was that while Urdaneta sent him no news, he maintained an active correspondence with the officers of his entourage, encouraging them to extract from him an unequivocal response. He wrote to O'Leary, "I need to know once and for all if the general does or does not accept the presidency." This is the general writing. Excuse me. "I need to know once and for all if the general does or does not accept the presidency, or if we will spend the rest of our lives chasing after an unreachable phantom." O'Leary, as well as others around him, tried to hold casual conversations that would provide some answer for Urdaneta, but the general's evasions were insurmountable. That was Urdaneta's letter to O'Leary. Excuse me, I read it as if it was the general, but no, Urdaneta is asking if the general will take the presidency. All right, top of page 219. I've been confused. When at last definitive news was received from Riohacha, it was more serious than any evil premonition. General Manuel Valdez, according to plan, had taken the city without resistance on October 20th, but the following week, Corujo wiped out 2 of his reconnaissance companies. Valdez presented what was intended as an honorable resignation to Montilla, but the general thought it ignoble. "That swine, he's dying of fright," he said. In only 2 weeks, they were to attempt the capture of Maracaibo, according to the original plan, but simple control of Riohacha was by now an impossible dream. "God damn it," shouted the general. "The cream of my generals haven't been able to put down a barracks revolt." Nevertheless, the news that affected him most was that the people fled at the approach of government troops because they identified them with the general, whom they considered the murderer of Admiral Padilla, an idol in his native Riohacha. This calamity, moreover, seemed to coincide with others throughout the country. Anarchy and chaos raged everywhere, and Urdaneta's government was incapable of controlling them. On the day he found the general hurling biblical curses at a special emissary who had just brought the latest news from Santa Fe de Bogota, Dr. Gestobondo was amazed once again at the revivifying power of rage. "The government's not worth shit. Instead of engaging The people and the men who matter, it paralyzes them, the general shouted. It will fall again, and it will not rise up a third time because the men who form it and the masses who sustain it will be exterminated. The physician's attempts to calm him were futile. For when he finished lashing out against the government, he began at the top of his lungs to go down the black list of his staff. He said that Colonel Joaquin Barriga, hero of the 3 major battles, was capable of anything, even murder. He said that General Pedro Marguerito, whom he suspected of taking part in the conspiracy to kill Sucre, was not competent to command troops. He slashed General Gonzalez, his most devoted follower in Cauca, with a brutal, "His diseases are feebleness and farting." He collapsed, gasping into the rocking chair to give his heart the rest it had needed for 20 years. Then he saw Dr. Gastelbondo standing paralyzed with astonishment in the doorway, and he raised his voice. "After all," he said, "what can you expect of a man who's gambled away 2 houses at dice?" Dr. Gastelbondo was perplexed. "Whom are we talking about?" he asked. "Urdaneta," said the general. "He lost them in Maracaibo to a navy commander, but he made it appear on the documents as if he had sold them." He took in the air he needed. "Of course, they're all saints compared to the slippery bastard Santander," he continued. "His friends stole money from the English loans. They bought state bonds for 1/10 of their real value, and the state bought them back at 100%. He explained that in any event, he had not opposed the loans for fear of corruption, but because he knew they threatened the independence that had cost so much blood. "I despise debt more than I do the Spanish," he said. "That's why I warned Santander that whatever good we had done for the nation would be worthless if we took on debt, because we would go on paying interest till the end of time. Now it's clear. Debt will destroy us in the end." In the early days of the current government, he not only had agreed with Urdaneta's decision to respect the lives of the defeated, but had celebrated it as a new war ethic. "Our present enemy should not do to us what we did to the Spanish," that is, wage war to the death. But during his dark nights in Soledad, he reminded Urdaneta in a terrible letter that every civil war had been won by the side that was the most savage. "Believe me, my dear doctor," he told the physician, "our authority and our lives cannot be saved except at the cost of our enemy's blood." Then, with as little warning as when it began, his rage passed without a trace, and the general undertook the historical absolution of the officers he had just insulted. "In any case, I am the one who was wrong," he said. "They only wanted to win independence, something immediate and concrete, and damned if they haven't done that very well." He stretched out a hand that was just skin and bones so the doctor could help him to stand, and he concluded with a sigh, "But I've become lost in a dream, searching for something that doesn't exist." It was during this time that he decided Iturbide's fate. Toward the end of October, Iturbide received a letter from his mother, who still lived in Georgetown, telling him that the progress made by the liberal forces in Mexico had moved the family further and further away from any hope of repatriation. This uncertainty, added to the doubts he had carried with him since childhood, became unbearable. One afternoon, when the general was walking along the corridor, leaning on Iturbide's arm, he happened to evoke an unexpected memory. "I have only one bad recollection of Mexico," he said. "In Veracruz, the harbor captain's mastiffs tore apart 2 pups I was taking with me to Spain." In any event, he said that was his first experience of the world, and it had marked him forever. Veracruz was supposed to be a brief stopover on his first trip to Europe in February 1799, but his stay lasted almost 2 months because of an English blockade of Havana, which was the next port of call. The delay gave him time to travel by coach to Mexico City, climbing almost 3,000 meters between snow-capped volcanoes and hallucinatory deserts, which were nothing like the pastoral dawns of the Arugua Valley, where he had lived until then. I thought it was how the moon must look, he said. In Mexico City, he was amazed at the purity of the air, dazzled by the profusion and cleanliness of the public markets, where red maguey worms, armadillos, river worms, mosquito eggs, grasshoppers, and larvae of black ants, wild cats, water beetles and honey, corn wasps, cultivated iguanas, rattlesnakes, all kinds of birds, midget dogs, and a strain of beans that jumped without stopping as if they had a life of their own, were all sold as food. They eat everything that moves, he said. He was astounded by the clear waters of the numerous canals crossing the city, the boats painted in Sunday colors, the splendor and abundance of the flowers, but he was depressed by the short February days, the taciturn Indians, the eternal drizzle, everything that would later oppress his heart in Santa Fe de Bogota, in Lima, in La Paz, up and down the entire length and height of the Andes, which he suffered then for the first time. The bishop, to whom he brought letters of introduction, took him by the hand to an audience with the viceroy, who seemed more episcopal than the bishop and paid almost no attention to the thin, dark boy who dressed like a dandy and declared his admiration for the French Revolution. "It could have cost me my life," the general said in amusement, "but perhaps I thought one had to say something about politics to a viceroy, and at the age of 16, that was all I knew." Before continuing his journey, he wrote to his uncle, Don Pedro Palacio y Soho. The first of his letters would be preserved. "My handwriting was so bad, I couldn't even read it." "Oh, even I couldn't read it," he said, weak with laughter, "but I explained to my uncle that the fatigue of travel made it look the way it did. In a page and a half, he made 40 spelling mistakes, 2 of them in the same word. Sun, S-U-N-N, for son, S-O-N. Iturbide could not comment, for his memory had nothing to remember. All he retained of Mexico was a recollection of misfortunes that had worsened his congenital melancholy, and the general had reason to understand this. "Don't stay with Urdaneta," he told him, "and don't go with your family to the United States. It's omnipotent and terrible, and its tale of liberty will end in a plague of miseries for us all." The effect of his words was to throw yet another doubt into a swamp of uncertainty. Iturbide exclaimed, "Don't frighten me, General." "Don't be frightened," said the general in a calm voice. "Go to Mexico, even if they kill you, or even if you die, and go now while you're still young, because one day it will be too late, and then you won't feel at home here or there. You'll feel like a stranger everywhere, and that's worse than being dead." He looked him straight in the eye, placed his open hand on his own chest, and concluded, "Just look at me." And so Iturbide left at the beginning of December with 2 letters for Urdaneta. One of them, the general said that Iturbide, Wilson, and Fernando were the most trustworthy people in his house. He stayed in Santa Fe de Bogota with no fixed destination until April of the following year, when Urdaneta was deposed by a Santanderist conspiracy. With her exemplary persistence, his mother arranged for him to be named secretary of the Mexican legation in Washington. He spent the rest of his life in the oblivion of public service, and nothing was heard of the family until 32 years later, when Maximilian of Habsburg, installed as Emperor of Mexico by French arms, adopted 2 Iturbide boys of the 3rd generation and named them as successors to his chimerical throne. In the general's second letter to Urdaneta, he asked that all his past and future letters be destroyed, so that no trace would remain of his dark hours. Urdaneta did not oblige the general, who had made a similar request to General Santander 5 years before. "Don't have my letters published, whether I'm alive or dead, because they are written with a good deal of freedom and disorder." He was not obliged by Santander either, whose letters, unlike those of the general, were perfect in form. Sorry, I lost my place. He was not obliged by Santander either, whose letters, unlike those of the general, were perfect in form and content, and it was evident at first glance that he wrote them with the awareness that their ultimate destination was history. Starting with the letter from Veracruz and ending with the last one he dictated, 6 days before his death, the general wrote at least 10,000 letters, some in his own hand, others dictated to his secretaries, still others composed by them according to his instructions. A little over 3,000 letters and some 8,000 documents with his signature have been preserved. Sometimes he drove his secretaries mad, or vice versa. Once he thought a letter he had just dictated was not written in a fair hand, and instead of ordering another copy, he himself added a line about the secretary. "As you must realize, Martel is more imbecilic than ever today." In 1817, on the eve of his departure from Angostura to complete the liberation of the continent, he brought his governmental affairs up to date with 14 documents dictated in a single sitting. Perhaps this was the origin of the legend, which has never been disproved, that he would dictate several letters to several different secretaries at the same time. October was reduced to the sound of rain. He did not leave his room again, and Dr. Gastelbondo had to call on his most learned resources so that he would permit the doctor to visit and feed him. During the general's pensive siestas, when he lay in the hammock without moving and contemplated the rain in the deserted square, Jose Palacios had the impression that he was calling to mind even the smallest details of his past life. "Merciful God," he sighed one afternoon, "what has happened to Manuela?" "All we know is that she's well, because we haven't heard anything about her," said Jose Palacios. For silence had surrounded her ever since Urdaneta assumed power. The general had not written to her again, but he instructed Fernando to keep her up to date on their journey. Her last letter had arrived late in August, and it contained so much confidential news concerning preparations for the military coup that between her illegible writing and the deliberate obfuscation of facts in order to throw the enemy off the track, it was not easy to unravel its mysteries. Forgetting the general's good advice, and with thorough and perhaps excessive jubilation, Manuela had assumed her role as the nation's leading Bolivarist and unleashed her own paper war against the government. President Mosquera did not dare take action against her, but he did not prevent his ministers from doing so. Manuela responded to the aggressions of the official press with printed diatribes that she distributed on horseback, escorted by her slave women along the Cal Real. Her lance at the ready, she pursued those who distributed broadsides against the general down the cobbled alleyways of the outlying districts, and with even more insulting slogans, she covered over the painted insults that appeared every day on the walls. In the end, the official war was waged against her in her own name, but she did not flinch. Her confidants inside the government informed her, on a day of patriotic fiestas, that fireworks were being mounted on the main square with a caricature of the general dressed as the King of Fools. Manuela and her slave women rode roughshod over the guards and knocked down the structure in a cavalry charge. Then the mayor himself, at the head of a squad of soldiers, tried to arrest her in her bed, but she was waiting for them with a pair of cocked pistols, and mediation by friends of both parties was all that prevented an even greater misfortune. The only thing that placated her was General Urdanetta's assumption of power. She had a true friend in him, and Urdaneta had in her his most enthusiastic accomplice. When she was alone in Santa Fe de Bogota, while the general was fighting in the south against the Peruvian invaders, Urdaneta was the trusted friend who saw her to safety and attended to her needs. When the general made his unfortunate statement in the Admirable Congress, it was Manuela who convinced him to write to Urdaneta, "I offer you all my old friendship and an absolute and heartfelt reconciliation." Urdaneta accepted the gallant offer, and after the military coup, Manuela returned the favor. She disappeared from public life in so absolute a fashion that by the beginning of October, the rumor was circulating that she had gone to the United States, and no one disputed it. And therefore, José Palacios was right. Manuela was fine because they had heard nothing about her. During one of those meticulous examinations of the past, when he was lost in the rain, sick of waiting and not knowing for what or for whom or why, the general touched bottom. He cried in his sleep. When José Palacios heard the quiet sobs, he thought they came from the stray dog picked up on the river. But they came from his master. He was disconcerted because during their long years of intimacy he had seen him cry only once, and that had been with rage, not with sorrow. He called Captain Ibarra, who was standing watch in the corridor, and he too listened to the sound of tears. "That will help him," said Ibarra. "It will help all of us," said José Palacios. The general slept later than usual. He was not awakened by either the birds in the nearby orchard or the church bells, and José Palacios bent over the hammock several times to see if he was breathing. When he opened his eyes, it was past 8 o'clock, and the heat had begun. "Saturday, October 16th, said José Palacios, "the day of purity." The general got up from the hammock and looked through the window at the solitary, dusty square, the church with the peeling walls, the turkey buzzards fighting over the remains of a dead dog. The harshness of the early sun announced a day of suffocating heat. "Let's get out of here," said the general. "I don't want to hear the shots of the firing squad." José Palacios shuddered. He had lived that moment in another place and another time, and the general, just as he had been then, was barefoot on the rough bricks of the floor, wearing long underpants and the sleeping cap on his shaved head. It was an old dream, repeated in reality. "We won't hear them," said José Palacios, and he added with deliberate precision, "General Piar was shot in Angostura, and not today at 5 in the afternoon, but on a day like today 13 years ago." General Manuel Piar, a hard mulatto from Corazon, who at the age of 35 had earned as much glory as anyone in the national militias, had put the general's authority to the test at a time when the liberating army required its forces united as never before in order to stop Murillo's advances. Piar called on blacks, mulattoes, zambos, and all the destitute of the country to resist the white aristocracy of Caracas, personified by the general. Piar's popularity and messianic aura were comparable only to those of José Antonio Páez, or the royalist Boves, and he even made a favorable impression on some white officers in the liberating army. The general had exhausted all his arts of persuasion, and on his orders, Piar was arrested and brought to Angostura, the provisional capital, where the general was entrenched with the officers close to him, several of whom would accompany him on his final journey along the Magdalena River. A court-martial named by him, which included friends of Piar, passed summary judgment. Jose Maria Carreño acted as prosecutor. Piar's official advocate did not have to lie when he praised him as one of the outstanding heroes in the struggle against the power of Spain. He was declared guilty of desertion, insurrection, and treason, and was condemned to death and the loss of his military titles. Knowing his merits, no one believed that the sentence would be confirmed by the general, least of all at a time when Maurier had captured several provinces and morale was so low among the patriots that there was fear of a rout. The general was subjected to every kind of pressure. He listened with cordiality to the opinions of his closest friends, Briceño Mendez among them, but his determination was unshakable. He revoked the sentence of demotion and confirmed the sentence of death by firing squad, which he made even worse by ordering a public execution. It was an endless night when anything evil could happen. On October 16th, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the sentence was carried out under the brutal sun in the main square of Angostura, the city that Piar himself had wrested from the Spanish 6 months before. The commander of the firing squad had ordered the removal of the remains of a dead dog that the turkey buzzards were devouring, and he had the gates closed to keep stray animals from disrupting the dignity of the execution. He denied Piar the final honor of giving the order to fire and blindfolded him against his will, but he could not prevent him from bidding farewell to the world with a kiss to the crucifix and a salute to the flag. The general had refused to witness the execution. The only man with him in his house was Jose Palacios, who saw him struggling to hold back the tears when he heard the volley. In his proclamation to the troops, he said, "Yesterday was a day of sorrow for me." For the rest of his life, he would repeat that it was a political necessity that saved the country, persuaded the rebels, and avoided civil war. In any case, it was the most savage use of power in his life, but the most opportune as well, for with it he consolidated his authority, unified his command, and cleared the road to his glory. 13 years later, in the town of Soledad, he did not even seem to realize that he had been the victim of one of time's caprices. He continued to look out at the square until an old woman in rags crossed the plaza, leading a burro loaded down with coconuts to be sold for their milk, and the turkey buzzards were frightened away by their shadows. Then he returned to the hammock with a sigh of relief, and without anyone's asking, he gave the answer that Jose Palacios had wanted to hear ever since the tragic night in Angostura. "I would do it again," he said. And that's the end of that chapter. All right, this is the beginning of the final chapter. We'll get a couple pages in here. The greatest danger was walking, not because of the risk of a fall, but because the effort it cost him was too evident. On the other hand, it was reasonable for someone to help him up and down the stairs in the house, even if he was capable of doing it alone. Nevertheless, when he in fact needed an arm to lean on, he did not allow anyone to offer him one. "Thank you," he would say, "but I can still do it myself." One day, he could not. He was about to descend a flight of stairs alone when the world disappeared. "I lost my footing, I don't know how. I was half dead," he told a friend. It was worse than that. It was a miracle he did not kill himself, because the fainting spell threw him against the side of the stairs and he did not roll all the way down, only because his body was so light. Dr. Gastelbundo rushed him to the Barranca de San Nicolas in the carriage of Don Bartolome Molinares, who had housed the general on an earlier visit and had ready for him the same large, airy bedroom facing the Kal Ansha. On the way, a thick substance that gave him no peace began to ooze from his left tear duct. He was detached from everything as he traveled, and at times he seemed to be praying, when in reality he was murmuring entire stanzas from his favorite poems. The doctor wiped his eye with his handkerchief, surprised that the general did not do it himself, since he was so punctilious about his personal cleanliness. He barely roused himself at the entrance to the city, when a herd of runaway cows almost trampled the carriage, and did, in fact, overturn the berlin belonging to the parish priest, who somersaulted into the air and then leaped to his feet, white with sand from head to toe and with his forehead and hands bloodied. When he recovered from the shock, the grenadiers had to open a path through the idle onlookers, naked children who wanted only to enjoy the accident, and had no idea of the identity of the passenger, who looked like a seated corpse in the darkness of the carriage. The doctor introduced the priest as one of the few who had supported the general in the days when the bishops thundered against him from their pulpits, and he was excommunicated for being a lecherous mason. The general did not seem to understand what had happened, and only became aware of the world when he saw blood on the cassock of the priest, who asked him to intervene with his authority to keep cows from wandering loose in a city where it was no longer possible to walk in safety because of all the carriages on public thoroughfares. "Don't let it bother you, your reverence," he said, without looking at him. "It's the same all over the country." The 11 o'clock sun hung motionless over the sand pits of the wide, desolate streets, and the entire city reverberated with heat. The general was glad he did not have to spend more time there than necessary to recuperate from the fall, and he wanted to go out sailing on a day when the seas were rough, because the French manual said that seasickness was good for ridding the body of bilious humors and cleansing the stomach. He soon recovered from the fall, but it was not easy to arrange for a boat and bad weather. In a fury at his body's recalcitrance, the general did not have strength for any social or political activity, and if he received visitors, they were old friends who came to the city to say goodbye. The house was large and as cool as November would allow, and its owners converted it into his personal hospital. Don Bartolome Molinares was one of the many people ruined by the wars that had left him with nothing but the position of postmaster, which he had held for the past 10 years without pay. He was such a kind-hearted man that the general had called him Papa ever since his previous visit to the city. His wife, a splendid-looking woman with an indomitable matriarchal vocation, spent her hours making bobbin lace, which she sold at a good price on the European ships, but from the moment the general arrived she devoted all her time to him, to the point where she came into conflict with Fernanda Barriga because she put olive oil in his lentils, convinced that it was good for diseases of the chest, and he was obliged to eat them out of gratitude. What bothered the general most during this time was the oozing tear duct, which kept him in a somber frame of mind until he at last agreed to chamomile eye washes. After that, he joined the card games, an ephemeral consolation for the torment of the mosquitoes and the sorrows of twilight. During a half-serious conversation with the owners of the house, he surprised them by declaring in one of his few crises of repentance that one good agreement was worth 1,000 successful lawsuits. "In politics, too?" asked Senor Molinares. "Above all in politics," said the general. "Our not making peace with Santander has ruined us all." "As long as you have friends, there is hope," said Molinares. "On the contrary, it was not the perfidy of my enemies, but the diligence of my friends that destroyed my glory. It was they who launched me on the calamity of the Ocaña Convention, who entangled me in the disaster of the monarchy, who obliged me first to seek re-election with the same arguments they latter used to force my renunciation, and who now hold me captive in this country when I no longer have any reason to be here. The rain became eternal, and the humidity began to open cracks in his memory. The heat was so intense that even at night the general had to change his drenched shirt several times. "I feel as if I've been choked in a double boiler," he complained. One afternoon he spent more than 3 hours sitting on the balcony and watching the debris of the poor districts wash down the street, the household utensils and dead animals swept away by the torrent of a seismic downpour that endeavored to pull up houses by their roots. Commander Juan Glenn, the prefect of the city, arrived in the middle of the storm with the news that he had arrested a woman in Senor Visbal's service for selling as holy relics the hair the general had cut off in Soledad. Once again he became despondent at the sorrowful thought that everything of his would turn into goods for sale. "They already treat me as if I had died," he said. Senora Molinares had pulled her rocking chair up to the card table so she could hear every word. "They treat you like what you are," she said, "a saint." "Well," he said, "if that's the case, they should let that poor innocent go." He did not read again. If he had to write letters, he was satisfied with giving instructions to Fernando, and he did not even look at the few he had to sign. He spent the morning on the balcony, contemplating the sand desert of the streets, watching the water burro pass by, and the brazen, cheerful black woman who sold sun-dried mojara fish, and the children leaving school at the stroke of 11, and the parish priest in his tattered, patched cassock, who blessed him from the atrium of the church and was melting in the heat. At 1 o'clock, while the others were taking their siestas, he walked along the putrefying gutters, frightening away with his mere shadow the flocks of turkey buzzards from the market, greeting the few people who recognized him, even though he was half dead and wore civilian clothes, walking as far as the grenadiers' barracks, a large shed of cane and mud that faced the river port. He was concerned for the morale of the troops, who were rotting with a boredom that seemed far too evident in the disorder of the barracks, where the stench had become unbearable. But a sergeant, who appeared to be in a stupor because of the suffocating afternoon heat, left him flabbergasted with the truth. "What's fucked us up isn't morale, Excellency," he told him. "It's gonorrhea." Only then did he learn the facts. The local doctors, having exhausted their science with distracting enemas and milk sugar palliatives, had passed the problem on to the military authorities, who could not agree on what to do. The whole city was aware of the danger that threatened it, and the glorious army of the Republic was seen as the emissary of a plague. The general, less alarmed than had been feared, resolved the matter with one stroke by imposing an absolute quarantine. When the lack of news, either good or bad, began to drive him to despair, a courier on horseback brought an obscure message from General Montilla in Santa Marta. "The man is ours, and negotiations are going well." The general thought the message so strange, and its form so irregular, that he interpreted it as a staff matter of the greatest significance, perhaps related to the Rio Hacha campaign, to which he attributed a historic importance that no one wished to contemplate. I think that is where we'll stop for this section on the bottom of page 238, just into the beginning of the last chapter. And so join me next time to find out our next book and to finish off The General in His Labyrinth by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I just picked up our next book from the library, so I will have it ready to go to announce for next time. Anyway, hope you're having a good day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye.